This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people. It caters to so many interests like illustration, graphic design, photography, and many more. Recently, I took a very informative class by Jia Graham on hand lettering in Procreate, fundamentals to finishing touches. I majored in graphic design, so typography wasn't something foreign to me. However, hand lettering wasn't as big of a subject, whereas with the boom of social media, this has become a very important part of graphic design that I felt like I missed out on. With hand lettering, you are able to elevate such simple layouts into something much more eye-catching and engaging. Things like business cards, logos, to home decor, to even my YouTube thumbnails, which I often need to make. And lettering has just become such an important part of today's aesthetics. I found that this class not only brushed over the fundamentals I learned back from university, but she also provided many thorough demonstrations on how I can create my own hand lettering styles. This is just one of the many classes available on Skillshare, so you can pick different subjects that you're interested in learning. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description box, you can get a free membership trial or less than $10 a month for an annual membership, which is an amazing deal to have all these resources available for you without any ads in between, so you can stay focused wherever creativity takes you. Explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity with Skillshare. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to be painting a scene of a beach in sunset. I was browsing and I found this picture. I'm not really sure who it's by, so please let me know if you do. I really like the color scheme and the reflection from the sky on the water, and since I'm not good with landscape painting, I wanted to learn from this picture, so I took the basic idea of the composition and tried to paint my version. I learned a lot from this photo, and hopefully the steps are easy enough for you to follow along too. So I started out like usual by just masking out my paper so it's easier to get clean edges. Then I start to sketch out the basic composition. As you can see, I always like to start with the horizon line, so I know the ratio between the beach and the sky. And in terms of the water, I want to make sure that the water is following the diagonal composition, so the composition doesn't look too one-dimensional. Once I've placed the line, it's much easier for me to draw the water. I just make sure that the curves I'm making are somewhat flat, following the surface of the sand. The basic idea is the further away the water is, and the closer it gets, the curves are going to be much wider. Here I'm making sure that those lines are not completely even all throughout, so some of the curves are further away than others, and I try to make those edges a bit uneven so it looks natural. I'll leave a link to the reference photo in the description box if it's a bit easier for you to look at it, but hopefully you can see a bit of what I mean from the thumbnail of the reference photo. You'll notice that I'm adding an additional layer to the water, and that's basically to separate the sea foam from the wet sand, which is still going to have reflections from the sky, but I'm just separating it so I know which color to use when I'm painting later on. Now I'm adding sand dunes and plants, which are going to be painted as the silhouettes later. You can also draw the trees in if you would like, but I'm just going to paint the palm trees freehand later. I tried to place the basic necessities for the outline, so this is just personal for me. You can add whatever you need to. So even this area that I'm drawing right now, I'm only doing this very roughly to remind myself to add those features in. If you look at the reference photo, you'll see that the edges of the sea foam separates the sea foam and the wet sand in some of the areas, and those edges are quite clean, whereas other areas are blended very well in terms of colors. So to separate those areas, I'm going to use my masking fluid pen. And to extract the masking fluid, I do have to press down quite hard, which can end up damaging your watercolor paper you've painted on. So I make sure to extract the masking fluid on scrap paper first before placing them on paper that I'm working on. Personally, I really love how convenient this pen is, but you can use any masking fluid that you're used to. After looking at those curves, I didn't really like how these lines are intersecting with each other, so I'm just going to take off the masking fluid in that area before I start painting. And here are the colors that I'm going to use. Firstly, I have Compost Blue by Holbein, Gray of Grey by Holbein, Ultramarine Deep by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Lemon Yellow by Holbein, and Ivory Black by Holbein. I'm going to start by painting the sky. As you can see, there's an array of beautiful colors, and I'm going to start by just dampening the surface of my paper for the portion of that sky that I'm going to paint on. I don't want the water to be too wet here, but I do want a fairly even distribution for a damp surface. I'm going to start by mapping out the lightest color. I'm using lemon yellow here. The reason why I'm starting with this color is because we are going to be adding dark clouds, so I don't want to accidentally misplace those dark colors and muddy the brightest areas. Next, I'm going to make an orange tone by using a mixture of lemon yellow, Jaune Brilliant with Quin Red, and I'm going to help frame the yellow that I painted. But because the surface is wet, the paint will spread, and this is why I'm keeping a safe distance even with those lighter colors, just in case too much of the orange run into the yellow, so I'm just being extra careful here. I'm just going to place the colors around. After the orange, I added a bit more Quin Red, and I added more of the orange upwards. I also tried to bring the orange and the yellow closer together without them blending too much by just moving them around with my brush very carefully. The flow of paint on your paper will depend on how wet the surface is, and I think people sometimes miscalculate that the paint you're putting on the wet surface also has a lot of water, so the paint might end up traveling faster than expected, which is why I prefer the surface to only be slightly damp, especially when I'm painting on a fairly small area. So here I'm just leaving out space for the clouds at the top and the bottom portion of the sky. I also tried to figure out the shape by painting the uneven edges with orange. Then for the clouds, I'm going to start with a light purple color. I used a mixture of Quin Red Ultramarine Deep with a bit of Gray of Grey, and I tried to place them lightly on those white areas. And for some of the darker areas of the clouds, I like to map it out by using more Ultramarine Deep in the mixture. I can see that some of the purple is starting to travel downwards, and I want to keep the horizontal composition for the clouds, so I'm going to add Jaune Brilliant underneath while the paint is still slightly damp. And meanwhile, I also added some more Quin Red to break the large orange area. Now that I have the top portion mapped out, I'm going to add Ivory Black to the top section to mute the purple, and as for the bottom, I'm going straight in with a mix of Ultramarine Deep, Quin Red, Ivory Black, and a small touch of Gray of Grey. And because I am working with the dark tone straight away, I'm trying to keep a bit of distance between the orange so it doesn't muddy the lighter areas just like before. For the edges of the dark clouds, I added more Quin Red in the mixture so it turns more into muted red-purple. And as you can see, some areas of the paper is now dry, so you can see very sharp edges for some of the paint that I've put down. So I'm going to soften them using a damp brush and carry the excess paint upwards. I'm done with the first layer, so I'm just using my hairdryer to dry the paint. This way I can add more pigments without them spreading. So I'm going to go back to paint in the dark clouds again and make the separation a bit more visible, and also increase the vibrancy of some parts of the orange sky. I also decided to add a bit more detail by adding smaller dark clouds, and because the surface is now completely dry, you can see that the shape pops out a bit too much since you get very clean edges. But when this happens, I can just soften it with a clean damp brush to get the soft edges. Here I'm adding Quin Red to the orange area again to break the space a bit and create layers of clouds. And as for the bottom, I'm going to treat it similarly to how I painted the dark clouds on top. As a bit of touch up for the sky, I want the yellow to be brightest on the right hand side, so I'm going to use the thin consistency of Quin Red to paint a bit on the left side. Then I'm just going to dry it off and start working on the beach. I want to start with a mixture of Quin Red and Jaune Brilliant to create a very bright pink color. I'm using a medium to thick consistency here to paint some of the wet sand as well as some of the edges of the sea foam. As I'm painting this, you'll notice that I keep using a horizontal motion. This is to depict the flat surface of the sand and also to create a little bit of perspective as the horizontal motion becomes slightly further apart as it gets closer to the foreground. For the pink of the sea foam, I made the color slightly lighter because I want to mix it with some blues and purples later. So I want to work fairly quickly here so the surface doesn't dry off too fast. And as for the purple, I used a mixture from the purple from the sky, but I just added more compost blue and Quin Red to give a bit more pigments, and add a little bit of compost blue by itself also, just so I have an array of colors to depict the reflection from the sky. So now I'm just going to apply the same colors from the pink, blue, and purple to paint the rest of the sea foam, but I just want to make sure that I have more pink at the edges and a bit more purples and blues on the left side. For this, I used the blue quite limitedly also because I want the purple to still be a bit more dominant. Around the edges of the masked areas, I decided to add more purple to separate the sea foam and the wet sand. I know that the reference is not quite the same, but I just felt like it needed a bit of extra separation for my painting. Next, I'm going to paint the sand. For this, I'm going to use a mixture of ivory black, ultramarine deep, and Quin Red to make a muted purple. And we're going to shift the ratio of color as I paint upwards closer to the horizon. So at the bottom, I want the color to almost be black, the middle to be more of a muted blue-purple, and the top to be more of a muted red-purple. While applying these colors, I'm not too worried about the edges of the wet sand yet, but I do want to avoid covering them in the dark color as best as I can at this point. You can see that the base layer is very messy, but that's okay because I'm going to keep layering on more paint. And here's where I start to paint the edges of the wet sand. I use the muted red-purple mix, and I'm using this to paint the edges using the horizontal motion that I used to paint the sea foam, and I am also going to slowly build up the muted purple of the sand. I'm quite happy with the vibrancy of colors here, so I'm just going to dry off the surface completely, and after that I'm going to paint the silhouette. I'm going to paint the main silhouette first on the horizon line, and I'm starting with the right hand side using a very thick consistency of ivory black, and I'm applying the color by tapping my brush to get uneven edges. As I get towards the middle, I want to shift the color a bit by adding some Quin Red in the mixture, but still in a very thick consistency, very close to black. Then on the left side, I'm going to add Gray of Gray with Ultramarine Deep, and I'm going to connect those colors together as the silhouette. I found that this part of the painting is very interesting. I never really thought of using a muted pastel color to paint the silhouette, which is why it's really fun and really good to paint straight from photo reference sometimes to gain extra knowledge on the subject you're painting. After I'm done with the main silhouette, I'm just going to add the rest of the sand dunes using purely ivory black. This part of the water I found looks a bit awkward, so I decided to extend the wet sand further by lifting some of the paint using a clean damp brush. Now that the wet sand and the sea foam is completely dry, I can see that the paint has faded a bit, and I want to also add a bit more detail on the water surface. I'm essentially going to use the same colors as before, so the pinks, blues, and purples, but I decided to add a bit of ivory black to the purple to mute the colors so it acts as a slight vignette to the painting. I'm applying this the same way as before by using a horizontal motion, but I am using a smaller brush now so I can get a bit more texture and detail this way. I'm going to do the same thing for the sand. I'm using the dark purple color in a slightly thicker consistency, and I'm going to paint using the horizontal motion to give the sand a bit more texture so it doesn't look completely flat as the base color. And I'm also going to use a slight dry brush consistency to add the dry brush texture on the sand. Once I'm done, I want to make sure everything is completely dry so when I take off the masking fluid, it won't rip the paper. For the edges of the seafoam, it's very glaringly white at the moment, so I'm going to use a bit of compost blue to add around the edges while leaving a bit of white from the paper as well. For this intersection between the seafoam, I'm going to color in the middle with purple so you can see the line for the edges. Then I'm going to add shadows using the dark purple mix and apply this under the seafoam on the areas closer to the foreground, and this will just add a bit of lift to the seafoam. Here I've got the colors down already, so I'm going to do a few adjustments for the edges, textures, or if I need to add a bit more color to add the vibrancy on certain areas. Okay, so once I'm done and everything is completely dry, I'm going to add the details of the palm trees. This was so fun to paint because this brings together the whole painting. As I mentioned before, I am comfortable with painting this freehand, but you can also draw this out with pencil first if you're a bit worried about the placement or composition of the trees. For this, I just want to make sure that the trees all have different heights, and it's also fun to do a few wavy tree trunks to add a bit more movement to the composition. The leaves might be a bit tricky, and you can switch to a smaller brush for this or even use a brush pen for more control. So to paint the leaves, I like to imagine a star or a sparkle shape with the tips flopping downwards, if that makes sense. Then I just like to add lines for the leaves. The bottom of the palm trees look a bit bare at the moment, so I'm going to add extra textures to suggest vegetation. And as for the tiny palm trees on the left side, I'm going to use the same colors as the silhouette. So in the middle, I used ivory black with quin red, and as for the left side, I added more gray of gray and ultramarine deep in the mix. After I'm done with the palm trees and I looked at the painting as a whole, I think I'm done with this painting. So I'm just going to unmask the sides and reveal the painting. And this is the completed painting. I learned so much from this, and I think I'm starting to get the hang of landscape painting with watercolors, which makes me quite happy, and I hope you guys enjoyed this one as well. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!